Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again William Engdahl. He's the author of one of the most insightful and I think correct accounts of American monetary history that I have ever read, and that is The Gods of Money. And now he has published another book. Well, actually, he's published many, many books over the years, but he's published another book that we want to talk to him a little bit about today. It's called The Lost Hegemon, Whom the Gods Would Destroy. And, of course, he's talking about the existing hegemon, of which yours truly is sitting in its very heart here in New York City. You know, I hope that all of you listening to this show will pick up a copy of William's book, the latest book, The Lost Hegemon. To do so, you can click on the banner at J. Taylor Media, and it will take you right to a place where you can buy the book. William writes many articles that you can avail yourself to free of charge. Go to williamengdahl.com. That's Engdahl spelled ENGDHAL.com. Go there and avail yourself to many of the articles, and one, in fact, I want to talk to him today about is titled, Why Are Russia and China Buying Gold? Tons of it. So, William, I'm really glad you could join me again. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us.
Well, I always enjoy talking with you.
It's always fun and always insightful. You tell us things that we don't hear very often or never hear in the United States because it's in somebody's interest for us not to hear that. I'd like, as I say, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this Russia and China buying gold article that you wrote. In 1971, after Nixon closed the gold window and thus shut down the international gold standard, Kissinger arranged to keep value in the dollar, keep a bid under the dollar, by arranging with Saudi Arabia to demand dollars for oil sales. Can you talk a little bit about how that has impacted geopolitics globally and why it is important to know that fact in the context of your article, Why China and Russia Are Now Building Up Their Gold Reserves?
Well, Jay, the August 1971 decision by Richard Nixon to tear up an international treaty that had been agreed by all of the Bretton Woods partners, and unilaterally, without agreement of the other parties, without the French or the Germans or the Japanese or anybody signing on to that, because simply the U.S. post-war economy had become obsolescent, stagnant. The technology base of the steel industry, the automobile industry, and so forth by 1967, 1969 was slipping far behind the quality of the Europeans. The Europeans were turning out world-class cars. The Germans still turn out the best cars ever on the broad range in the world that I know of. Mm-hmm. And so they began building up surplus dollars in their trade accounts because Americans preferred to buy quality cars and not a piece of junk that Detroit was beginning to turn out back then. So they were buying Japanese, German, and just to an extent French cars, but the quality wasn't as good. And by 1967, the crisis of the Bretton Woods system broke on the trading floor of the British Bank of England, mm-hmm. on the gold trading floor, because the French and other parties were demanding, instead of dollars, they were demanding gold, which under Bretton Woods rules was an option. Mm-hmm. If the central bank held so many $1 billion, they could redeem it in gold bullion. Well, the gold vaults of the City of London and the gold vaults, or the Bank of England, and the gold vaults of the Federal Reserve were becoming perilously drained in August 1971, such that a Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, who was rather little known at that point, but became infamous later, named Paul Volcker, advised Richard Nixon to simply shut the gold window of the New York Fed, which is what Nixon did. And it's important to know that Paul Volcker, his life long, has been not a protege, but a retainer, let's call it. He's a civil servant kind of retainer of David Rockefeller and the Rockefeller family. Managing, after he retired from the Fed, he managed the fortunes of the Rockefellers and his entire life before he came to Treasury in the late 60s. He was with Chase Manhattan Bank, the Bank of David Rockefeller. So U.S. went off the gold standard. The dollar promptly dropped 40% because the deficits of the federal government were getting huge. And in 1973, this is something as far as I know, I've uniquely put together. In 1973, in May, there was a meeting. Now, some people will say this is conspiracy theory. This is not conspiracy theory. This is a conspiracy fact. The Bilderberg meeting of that year, May 1973, featured, it was held in Saltsjöbaden, Sweden. I happened to be in secure possession of the confidential protocols of that meeting, the attendees list and so forth. They met in Saltsjöbaden, Sweden, outside Stockholm. It was David Rockefeller. It was the heads of all the major Anglo-American oil companies. The Rothschilds were there for BP, or Shell rather. And they talked about an approaching or imminent dramatic rise in the price of OPEC oil. And it was all in kind of coded language, but if you read it, it's very clear. The featured speaker selected to give it was Walter Levy, who was a consultant to what's today called ExxonMobil. And he outlined a price scenario where the price of OPEC oil would go up 400%. And in a short period of time. That's a huge shock to the world economy.
Sure.
And what did these Bilderberg chaps like Rockefeller and Rothschild and the heads of these oil companies talk about? They didn't talk about what diplomatic moves can we engage to convince the Saudis and the other OPEC producers not to do that. It's not in their interest. It's not in the world economy's interest. No, they said, what do we do with all the dollars? How do we recycle the petrodollars, as Kissinger put it? Kissinger was invited to that meeting, by the way. At the time, he was Secretary of State for Nixon. And so lo and behold, 6 months later, the Yom Kippur War kicks off, thanks in no small part to the shuttle diplomacy of Henry Kissinger between Damascus and Tel Aviv and so forth, lying to both sides. But the trigger was Kissinger armed Israel against the vehement protests of the King of Saudi Arabia. Right? And I had the pleasure, and it really was a pleasure, to be invited to an annual retreat or conference of the former oil minister, who was oil minister in 1973 when the crisis hit, Sheikh Zaki Yamani, in his residence outside of London. And after the conference presentation, he had read my book, A Century of War, where I all this, and he was just flabbergasted. And he said, Mr. Engdahl, I would like you to come to my home for dinner and a discussion because I'm completely fascinated by what you reveal in your book, Century of War. And in the course of the discussion, he was, well, I think he's still alive. He's a deep intellectual. He has a library, he told me, in Riyadh of some 50,000 volumes. And in his London home, he had a huge library. It was just beautiful. And, he was a genuine intellectual, a thinker. And he said, I'll tell you something. Until I read your book, nobody had put together what happened for this, the Yom Kippur War and the oil shock. And he said, I'll tell you a personal anecdote, Yamani said to me. I was asked by my king, and my king then treated me like one of his sons. He didn't trust his own sons. He sent me as the personal direct emissary of the King of Saudi Arabia to the Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi then, to ask the Shah, why are you at the December OPEC ministers meeting, heads of state meeting rather, 1973, why is Iran insisting on such a dramatic further price increase of oil? The first price increase was the embargo. But then what do you do after you lift the embargo? And Yamani said, I delivered the message from my king to the Shah. The Shah said to me, my dear Yamani, if your excellency wants the answer to his question, I suggest you go to Washington and ask Henry Kissinger. And that literally was a direct quote from Yamani. And in fact, Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller were the patrons of the Shah back then. And all the oil deposits went into Chase Manhattan Bank for the National Iranian Oil Company, things like that.
Yeah.
So then you had the game going. The dollar was suddenly supported by oil, which then was always traded after the war in dollars instead of pound sterling before the war, because the dollar was the dominant currency. It was fungible. Everybody could accept it and so forth. It was the world reserve currency. I think more than 85% of all central bank reserves back then, maybe even more. And so Kissinger called that recycling the petrodollars. get the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and so to invest. Suddenly they have 4 times more dollars for every barrel of oil they sell in the world market. So they were just rolling in dough, and the dough was dollar dough. So long about 2 years later, the structure started to get wobbly because Germany, Japan, France, as would be expected, began making proposals. Listen, we'll sell you German high technology to build your economy, Saudi Arabia, or Iran or Kuwait. But we want to buy your oil with German marks or French francs or Japanese yen. So Washington sent the Assistant Treasury Secretary, Jack Bennett, to Riyadh to cut a deal with the monarchy. The Saudis will guarantee that no OPEC member ever sells oil for any currency but dollars. And in return, U.S. will sell U.S. military equipment to create the most modern army in the Middle East, aside from Israel. And that was basically the deal. And that held until Saddam Hussein in Iraq, back before he was toppled by whatever desert thing it was called.
Desert Storm.
Yeah. Or the shock and awe.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
So that was the basis of what then was called the petrodollar. Today, we don't really have a petrodollar system, in my view. We had, and now what we have is a dollar backed by F-16 fighter jets and Abrams tanks, just raw military power. And that's a dangerous development because that's what it does is drive other countries like China and Russia to combine their strengths to cooperate and defend against this brute called Washington and the neocons that are making wars everywhere to keep the dollar alive. So it's a very, very shaky edifice. It's no longer a petrodollar currency.
All right. So, I was under the impression that the U.S. military was being used to try to force countries to continue to use the dollar to purchase oil and other items.
I don't think so. I don't feel that's the case. They can't really do much about the fact that Russia and China are doing multi-billion-dollar deals, or Iran is only accepting euros for its oil.
Okay, but you had mentioned that, and I think you were implying, and certainly we've had other guests on our show that have implied that the reason we went to war against Saddam was exactly that. He was wanting to pay for or wanting to accept euros. And then recently, I believe you did some work suggesting that the reason that the U.S. took out or destroyed Gaddafi was because he was competing with the dollar by setting up a gold dinar system there and wanted to expand that throughout a pan-African trading system, and they had to take care of him. So my thinking is that maybe what our military is trying to do is to force countries and to send a message to anybody else that might try to go off the dollar standard that they better not try to do that. What you're suggesting is if that is in their minds, they're not able to continue, or that's breaking down.
Their ability to achieve their objectives is declining dramatically, and that's why Washington is in such a feeding frenzy to make wars everywhere in Ukraine and Syria and Libya, to challenge the Chinese in the South China Sea. They're just hotted up in every part of the planet, it seems, these days. But it's not having the effect, and that's the fascinating thing, Jay. It's not having the effect because, you rub the magic genie and poof, this miracle happens. Another one bites the dust, another rival is eliminated, It's not happening.
Yeah. Okay, so we have this, it seems to me, a bipolar world to a great extent now. On the one hand, the countries, and I'm not really convinced that the Europeans, you would know better than I because you live in Germany, that the Europeans are as firmly behind the United States and NATO as we are led to believe in the United States they are. But it seems to me that you have the NATO bloc on the one hand, and on the other hand, then which includes, of course, Japan and Europe and the TPP, which the U.S. is has forced through, essentially to try to bring in other Asian countries to emasculate China, perhaps. But it seems to me that we have this bipolar world now, and this is where I think this is a very interesting what you're talking about. Why Russia and China are buying gold? Why are they? First of all, how much gold do you think China has been importing, and how much do they have? I know they're very secretive about it, and it's my sense that China would almost rather us not realize how much gold they're acquiring so that they can continue to do it at the most favorable price possible.
That's exactly the case.
Okay, so what is your sense, and how much gold has China acquired? And then in their policy, it's interesting to note, I think I read somewhere that they actually have a division of their army that's responsible for trying to acquire gold, in I guess, to explore and develop, or to build gold reserves in China. Mm-hmm. What is your sense in terms of the amount of gold that China has, and how does that play into, and how is that being used to try to defend their sovereignty against the NATO bloc?
China, this is a fascinating thing. I've had varying thoughts on that over the last couple of years, but I'm convinced that the Chinese government, through its sovereign wealth fund as well as its central bank, has perhaps 3 or 4 times more the amount of gold they claim they have reserves. They don't, like you say, they don't want to draw the red flag to the bull of Washington. So they simply lie. China, interestingly enough, is the world's, we have this impression that South Africa is the world's leading gold producer.
No more.
Guess what? It's number 7, and China is number 1 in tons mined per year. And interestingly enough, Russia is number 2. Mm-hmm. And both of those countries are buying gold in huge quantities at the time the price is significantly low, at 5-year lows. It's gone up a little bit since January, but that isn't anywhere near what it was 5 years ago. And what they are doing, in my view, is very quietly building the basis, and the Chinese Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road, this network, beautiful network, is one of the projects that will save mankind if we don't blow ourselves up with some stupid military moves beforehand, is the crisscrossing of all of Eurasia from the borders of the European Union, in fact, into the European Union, through Belarus, through Russia, into Central Asian countries, into Iran, into China, India now. Indonesia is going to become a partner to this through port development that will link the port side of the One Belt, One Road. And you will have a Eurasian continent independent of NATO, militarily defensible because it's a landmass, and the U.S. Navy, with its fleet of, lily pad bases on the aircraft carriers, becomes simply redundant. It becomes impotent. Mm-hmm. So what the stupidity of the neocons in Washington and the last government since George Herbert Walker Bush back in the 80s and Ronald Reagan created, they have now created the worst nightmare of geopolitics founder Alfred Mackinder in England, and that is a unity in the nations of Eurasia to defend against what they perceive as an enemy that's out to destroy them. Mm-hmm. And that is, the Washington policy is a policy of, I use the term empire because there's no better word to describe it, like the Roman Empire or the British Empire. It's an empire in its terminal decay phase, the last 30 or 40 years, and it's kept itself alive through looting the former states of the Soviet Union after 1990. Before that, it did it through various other means. And now and then came China with its cheap labor, so American multinationals, had a bonanza with that for a few years. But now all of that is coming to an end. China and Russia are making military cooperation like a NATO through the Shanghai Cooperation countries. They are building infrastructure. They don't want war. They want to build. They want to build up their economies. Mm-hmm. Russian economy since the Cold War and the Yeltsin plundering, they urgently want to build a new Russia, and they can build a new Russia. They have some of the most brilliant engineers and scientists on the planet, and I've met some of them. Mm-hmm. They are awesome. Mm-hmm. In America, we don't consider science and engineering to be salonfähig or chic anymore, and our children want to become Wall Street stockbrokers and criminal bankers instead.
Right. Parasites, essentially.
Yeah, parasites.
Well, that's really interesting then, but what role is gold playing? I mean, I noticed that it seems to me I've read that the Russians are essentially selling some oil to China in exchange for gold, and I suppose, the Russians are not accepting dollars for their oil sales. Maybe they do in some cases, I don't know. But
it's variable because of the sanctions they have to still. But
okay, but do you see the gold? Is the idea here to build up a monetary system, a stable monetary system, and with gold as its foundation among these?
I am convinced of that, Jay.
Yeah,
I am convinced of that. The Chinese are, they have this expression, lose face. Well, the face are these masks, if you've ever seen Chinese theaters with fixed expressions. So behind the mask, the real intention of the Chinese is beginning to emerge, the Central Bank of People's Bank of China and so forth, and that is to build an alternative monetary system to the dollar system.
Mm-hmm. One that will be stable, in fact. And as you pointed out, Russia's economy, Russia doesn't have hardly any debt to speak of. They're net exporters.
Yeah, they're not. When Moody's and company started calling them junk level debt when the sanctions were applied, this was a fraud. The Wall Street rating agencies, Russia has no danger of default. It had $300 billion in central bank reserves at that time. It had a national public debt of 18% of GDP. U.S. has 103. Greece has stratospheric. It's in the 200-300s. Japan, my God, these are countries.
Yeah, even worse. Yeah. I'm just wondering, though, the Chinese economy, in my way of thinking, and again, my way of thinking is influenced, as much as I don't want it to be, by the constant propaganda that we get here in the United States, that the Chinese economy probably does have some issues, does have some problems. The bridges that are built to nowhere and so forth, it is not a free market economy by any stretch of the imagination. But on the other hand, if you have a union of various countries that are combined with a stable and a sound asset-based monetary system, as opposed to the what I can only call a counterfeit fiat system that the West is built on without any gold, then I would think they would have a chance to come out of whatever problems that they have and to build up an economy better than we have here, where the parasites essentially have eaten away all the wealth of the middle class and the industrial base in the United States.
I fully agree with you, Jay. The problems of the Chinese economy are partly demographic. 30 years ago, they had the ideal demographics to have this unlimited flow, seemingly, of cheap labor from the rural countryside. That now is peaking out. It began back in 2008, according to studies I've seen, and 2007, 2008. And then the labor force in China began demanding and getting higher wages for their work. And at that point, I think the Western financial crisis began, not because of the real estate bubble, but because of that whole Chinese demographic shift. What the Chinese are doing now is transforming the economy into, they've built all the skyscrapers and the highways and all the things that they need internally. And now this is what the Silk Road is so beautiful about. It's $1 trillion potential project. I guess it probably will end up costing 2 or 3. And all of that investment will be for infrastructure, transportation arteries that will link the entire Eurasian land space, the biggest land space in the world, and bring transportation infrastructure into remote villages, into mining areas, into agriculture areas that never had access to a quote-unquote market before. And this is the real point, that this idea of free market, there is no free market in nature. There is no free market in the world. Markets are man-made. And when Milton Friedman or Washington talk about free trade and free markets, there's a lie behind that, because they know full well it's what the British did when they repealed the Corn Laws in the 19th century. It's free for the most powerful corporate interests to dominate the market. So it's not really free at all. It's just a nice, clever, rhetorical term.
Right.
But the markets that are going to be created across Eurasia are staggering.
Yeah.
This is going to bring trillions and trillions of dollars in the GDP of those countries. And we in the West are sitting there with our thumbs in a certain place, looking with our the politicians in Europe and so forth. Maybe now finally some of them are beginning to wake up and realize this is the salvation of the European economies, because they are bankrupt, they are over-indebted, and they are not generating jobs. Demographically, Europe is a dying continent. The United States has become a rust belt many, many years ago, and 2007 just kind of finished it off. It's just a disaster. So this is, as I say in some of my recent articles, the East is building and creating, the West is destroying and killing. Yeah, you can define the world by that very simple.
William, let me ask you: does India fit into this new environment, into this new system?
Absolutely.
I mean, because there you have, China and India with the two largest populations in the world. You have the raw materials from Russia and Iran and various places like that. It just really is an amazing connection when you think if India joins it. My sense has been that India has been more on the fence, trying
under Modi. Not anymore. No. Under Modi, India and China have come historically closer together than they have been in perhaps a century.
Yeah.
The British geopolitics was always to play India off against China and Russia. Russia has very good relations with the Modi government in India, defense sales and so forth. And India is a member of the BRICS group, which has this BRICS infrastructure bank, the New Development Bank. Yeah. So, and India now is formally linked into the China Silk Road. They are members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Oh, okay, that's very important. Yes.
As of this year, as is Pakistan, and this is the devilish thing. The British, when they dismembered India and Pakistan from the British Empire, Lord Mountbatten after World War II, they did so in a way to create permanent friction between those two countries, and Kashmir was the rubbing point of that friction. Now, and China, which has an interest in Kashmir as well, China, Pakistan, and India are all members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as is Russia. So it's a fascinating change.
Well, it is.
The world is changing, and the mainstream media in the West doesn't have a clue.
It's clueless. It seems to be clueless, no question about it. One other question comes to mind, though, as you talk about the BRICS. Brazil is having its trouble. I don't know if that trouble is as great as what we're led to believe it is having. I have an idea that probably there are some NGOs that are involved in there trying to stir things up. George Soros, everywhere you go, even
National Endowment for Democracy. I wrote about, I think, a year and a half, 2 years ago, when Rousseff was reelected. The U.S. did everything to destabilize that election.
Yeah,
and they failed. And this so-called Operation Car Wash, it's all a sting operation by the CIA, U.S. State Department, the NGOs of Washington, to get rid of one of the key pillars of the BRICS.
Right.
It's Petro-dollar scandal. It's as simple as that.
Right.
And they've organized the street protests like they do in Ukraine and all these other places, in Hong Kong with the Umbrella Revolution. And, the point isn't corruption. Who in Washington is not corrupted?
Exactly.
But the point is, what are national leaders doing for their country and for the world? And everything I see is that Dilma Rousseff, as was Lula before, but much more than Lula, is intent on developing Brazil as an alternative to an imperial satrapy of Washington, which it was after World War II.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating stuff, William. We're out of time. It always goes so fast with you. There were other articles I want to just mention to my listeners that they should go and read, and they all really, as I see it, dovetail into your last book, The Lost Hegemon, Whom the Gods Would Destroy. The stuff we're talking about today fits in with that. And this is an extremely well-documented book, as all of William's books are. I would really suggest strongly to my listeners you go buy this book, but also go to William's website. There's an article there I wanted to, if we had time, would ask William to talk about. We just simply don't have time. Iran links to Eurasia with the Persian Canal. China Railway links Ethiopia to the Red Sea. Amazing. I wasn't aware of this. Another article that I think is very interesting in light of what's going on now in Syria. Kurd autonomy. Is it Kerry's Plan B or Putin's Plan A? All very, very fascinating stuff, William. I want to thank you very much for being with us, and I hope we can do this more often.
I enjoy it very much, Jay, and from my side, I'd be more than willing.
Well, I want people to read your material because it gives them a chance to think outside of the box. So thank you very much for being with us, and we'll look forward to doing it again sometime in the near future.
Thank you, Jay.